Do you think you already know the Strait of Hormuz? You believe it is nothing more than a tense geopolitical coordinate, a suffocating choke point on the global energy map, because that is the only version the media has ever shown you. But have you ever imagined how a small, barren island, where temperatures can melt human will and fresh water is more precious than gold, became the center of imperial ambition for centuries? Why were some of history's most renowned explorers, from Marco Polo to Afonso de Albuquerque, willing to risk their lives just to set foot on this strip of salt-scorched land? Forget the headlines of the daily news. Hormuz is not a dry military outpost. It is a place where mountains of salt rise from the earth in colors like a rainbow, where deep red clay canyons resembling the surface of Mars collapse straight into the dark blue of the Persian Gulf. It is a civilization that survives not because of natural abundance, but because of its ability to transform harshness into a form of art. An island where the land itself tells stories, where salt is not just a mineral but the backbone of identity and pride. Here, power is not measured by weapons, but by the ability to endure under burning heat and the isolation of the sea. This is not the tense strait you have heard about. This is a surreal world where nature and history collide to create something unlike anywhere else on Earth. This is Unreal Hormuz. The Persian Gulf is, by most conventional ecological measures, an environment in which coral reef systems should not be able to function. Summer water temperatures regularly reach 96 degrees Fahrenheit. A level at which corals in virtually every other part of the world experience mass bleaching and death, unable to sustain the symbiotic algae that give them both color and the majority of their nutritional needs. The reefs around Hormuz Island and the strait's peripheral islands not only survive these temperatures, they have over thousands of years of exposure to the Gulf's extreme thermal cycling, developed a degree of heat tolerance that represents one of the most significant cases of adaptive evolution in modern marine biology. These corals carry, encoded in their biology, information about how reef systems can persist where persistence should be impossible. For the dive communities, marine biologists, and fishermen who work in relationship with the strait's reefs, their existence is both a resource and a reference point. The reefs support more than 700 fish species, sustaining the protein supply of coastal communities across the northern Gulf Coast. Their presence defines where fish aggregate, where nets are set, and where traditional fishing grounds have been maintained across generations. The Gulf's coral reefs became heat-tolerant through thousands of years of thermal exposure that killed less resilient individuals and left, as survivors, those whose physiology could accommodate extremity. This is evolution operating in visible, comprehensible time. The current threat is more rapid than adaptation can match. Oil contamination from tanker traffic, runoff from coastal development, and military activity in the reef zones all impose pressures for which no biological adjustment exists. Places like the Hormuz reefs remind us that survival is not a metaphor. It is a mechanism, and mechanisms can be broken. Along the southern and southeastern shoreline of Qeshm Island, the HARA forest covers approximately 30 square miles of tidal channels. And mudflats in a dense growth of Avicennia marina, a species of mangrove that has evolved a physiological solution to one of nature's more fundamental contradictions: how to grow in water that would kill almost any other plant. The HARA trees filter salt through their root systems, expelling it through their leaves in visible crystals, sustaining themselves in an environment of near-total salinity through a biological mechanism refined across millions of years. From the air, the forest reads as a dark green labyrinth pressed against the Gulf's blue edge. From within, at water level in a narrow boat, it is something closer to enclosure. The light filtered through dense canopy, the silence punctuated by the movement of birds that use the forest as a stopover on migrations spanning continents. For the fishermen who work the HARA channels, the forest is a production system, not a wilderness. It generates the nutrient conditions that support the shrimp and fish populations of the surrounding Gulf, functioning as a nursery for species that eventually move into deeper water and into nets. The communities that have fished these channels for generations developed harvesting patterns calibrated to the forest's seasonal rhythms, taking from it without exceeding what it could regenerate. The HARA forest became this dense through centuries of undisturbed tidal cycling in a Gulf that was, until recently, relatively free of industrial pressure. Today, it faces oil contamination from tanker traffic, warming water temperatures that stress the trees, and the increasing frequency of extreme heat events. What happens when the nursery of a sea is compromised is not an environmental abstraction. It is the direct elimination of a food system that coastal communities depend upon for daily survival. Places like HARA remind us that the most essential infrastructure is often the least visible. Rising from the Persian Gulf approximately 5 miles off the coast of Bandar Abbas, Hormuz Island spreads across roughly 18 square miles of some of the most geologically theatrical terrain on the planet. And yet, it is inseparable, in both geography and consequence, from the narrow corridor of water that surrounds it. A passage barely 21 miles across at its tightest point, through which the energy architecture of modern civilization flows each day without pause or guarantee. The island's mountains do not merely stand, they perform, layered in bands of iron oxide red, sulfuric yellow, salt white, and violet, stacked in formations that reflect 570 million years of compression, uplift, and mineral transformation beneath a sun that allows no shadow to soften what the rock is trying to say. While below them, supercarriers, the length of 4 city blocks, move through shipping lanes barely 2 miles wide in each direction, carrying approximately 21 million barrels of crude oil daily, representing 20% of the world's entire supply. Their wakes disturbing the same iron-rich coastline where the island bleeds its red mineral runoff slowly and without urgency into the Gulf. For the people who live within this dual reality, neither the geology nor the geopolitics registers as extraordinary. The same iron-rich clay that colors the coastline, known locally as galak, is incorporated into the local diet, mixed into a sauce called surak, pressed into flatbread, traded as a seasoning across the southern coast. While the marine pilots and small boat fishermen who share the strait's congested lanes treat the passage not as a symbol of global tension, but as a working environment defined by current, draft, and the particular alertness required when survival depends on reading the water correctly. This is a place where the most intimate human relationship with landscape, pressing the Earth's minerals into food, navigating its waters by inherited knowledge, coexists with the most abstract global dependency, where a community's daily sustenance and the financial stability of entire economies occupy the same narrow geography without ever quite acknowledging each other. Hormuz became this layered contradiction through processes operating at entirely different scales. The salt dome tectonics and desert erosion that produce the island's impossible colors over hundreds of millions of years, and the coincidence of geology and empire that formalized the strait as a choke point when industrial civilization built its energy infrastructure around Gulf reserves. Today, both pressures intensify simultaneously. The island's fragile soil and limited fresh water straining under the weight of the attention its visual power has attracted, while the strait carries not just oil, but the compounded anxiety of every economy that depends on it remaining open. Places like this remind us that the world's most vivid beauty and the world's most fragile stability have always had more in common than either headline or postcard suggests. Stretching approximately 87 miles along the northern edge of the strait, Qeshm is the largest island in the Persian Gulf, salt-scarred, wind-polished, and carrying its scale without grandeur. Temperatures regularly exceed 115 degrees Fahrenheit in summer, and the humidity rising from the Gulf makes the air feel less like something breathed than something worn against the skin without consent. For the people who live here, this extremity is the organizing principle of everything. The day does not follow the clock, it follows the heat. Before sunrise, when the air briefly releases its grip, the island stirs into concentrated activity. Fishermen push boats out before the water begins to shimmer, markets empty before shade disappears. And by early afternoon, Qeshm does not slow. It stops, not from laziness, but from generational understanding that certain hours belong entirely to the sun. Life resumes in the evening with the intensity of a community that has learned to compress its existence into the margins the climate allows. Houses are oriented to capture the northwest wind. Walls are thick for thermal mass, not grandeur. Water is managed with a discipline that outlasts the scarcity that originally created it. Qeshm became this way through tectonic forces that offered its inhabitants almost nothing easily, and demanded, in return, a quality of attention that left no room for abstraction. Along Qeshm's northwestern shore, the village of LAFT rises from the water in a configuration that suggests it was built not so much on the land as against it. Stacked houses of coral stone and mud brick pressing close together, with a skyline interrupted at irregular intervals by the vertical forms of BADGIR wind towers. Their open mouths oriented toward the prevailing breeze with a precision that no instrument guided. These structures, some more than 1,000 years old, are the region's solution to a problem that no modern engineering first solved. How to make the interior of a building survivable when the exterior air reaches 122 degrees Fahrenheit and conventional ventilation is impossible. For the families who live within the shadow of these towers, their function is neither historical nor decorative. The towers work. They channel cooler air from above, roof level downward, through a system of internal baffles, producing an interior temperature differential of 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit without electricity, without machinery, and without maintenance beyond the periodic repair of their mud brick channels. This is not a primitive technology awaiting improvement. It is a perfected one, evolved through centuries of iteration by communities for whom failure meant heat death. LAFT's 366 ancient wells tell a parallel story, a water management system designed so that each well was used only once per year in rotation, preserving freshwater reserves in an environment that generated almost none of its own. This level of systemic thinking, embedded in village infrastructure, is not romantic ingenuity. It is the outcome of survival pressure sustained over generations. In the boatyards along the coast of Qeshm and the Hormuz coast, men build ocean-going wooden vessels using a method that has no written form. The LENJ. A traditional Persian Gulf wooden boat capable of carrying cargo across open water, recognized by UNESCO as an element of intangible cultural heritage. Is constructed entirely from the accumulated spatial memory of its builders, passed from father to son through demonstration and repetition rather than specification and diagram. The curves of the hull, the angle of the keel, the placement of each structural member is held not in paper but in hands. That have felt the wood enough times to understand what it will do under stress at sea. For the men who build LENJ, this process is not an act of cultural preservation. It is a trade. The vessels are intended to work, to carry weight, to survive the Gulf's seasonal storms and navigate its shallow coastal waters. The fact that the knowledge required to build them exists nowhere except in the bodies of a diminishing number of craftsmen is not something that registers as a crisis until the number becomes too small to sustain. The LENJ tradition developed in response to the Gulf's trading geography. Vessels designed specifically for its depth profiles, its wind patterns, and the cargo networks that once connected Hormuz to ports across the Indian Ocean. The Portuguese documented their construction in the 16th century. They are still being built today by the same method. The current threat is institutional. New international maritime safety standards require certifications. That traditional wooden vessels cannot easily obtain, and the economic sanctions affecting Iran's trade networks have reduced the commercial viability of the craft significantly. On an island where summer temperatures make the outdoors a genuinely hostile environment, and where centuries of maritime trade brought cultures from across the Indian Ocean into sustained contact with local communities, the women of Hormuz developed a form of dress that is among the most immediately striking in the Gulf region, and among the most consistently misunderstood. Their garments are dense with embroidered color, deep gold, cobalt, and crimson, applied to fabric in patterns that hold specific regional and familial meaning, worn as a direct visual contrast to the austere aesthetic of more inland Islamic dress traditions. Above this, the borage mask, a structured face covering of embroidered fabric or leather, covering the nose and eyes, while leaving the lower face exposed. Functions simultaneously as sun protection, identity marker, and social signal. For the women who wear the borage, it is not a symbol of constraint. Its original function was environmental. The Gulf sun, reflected off salt water, creates a level of UV exposure that, without protection, damages the skin severely over a lifetime of outdoor work. The mask developed as a practical barrier, covering the most exposed facial surfaces. Over generations, its form became codified. The pattern and construction of a woman's borage communicates her marital status, regional origin, and, in some communities, her family lineage. It became a text legible to those who knew how to read it. The borage is now endangered, not by repression, but by the quiet retreat of the knowledge that gives it meaning. Younger women in coastal towns increasingly choose alternatives. The craftswomen who produce the masks represent a practice with fewer practitioners each decade. Places like Hormuz remind us that what looks from outside like aesthetic tradition is often, from inside, a technology of survival shaped over time into something that carries more than its original function. Accessible only by sea, set against the dramatic fjord landscape of the MUSANDAM Peninsula on the Omani side of the strait. Approximately 25 miles from the Iranian coast across open water, the village of KUMZAR occupies a position of such geographic isolation that it developed something almost no other place on Earth possesses. A language that belongs to nowhere else. KUMZARI is a spoken tongue constructed from fragments of Persian, Arabic, Portuguese, Hindi, and several other languages accumulated across centuries of contact with passing traders, sailors, and occupiers who passed through the strait without staying. It is, in linguistic terms, a fossil record of the Gulf's entire commercial history. Compressed into the daily speech of a few hundred people on a cliff above the sea. For the residents of KUMZAR, their language is not a curiosity. It is how they think. The village's physical isolation, reachable in summer by a boat journey of roughly an hour from the nearest road, and occasionally inaccessible during periods of rough water, has historically protected both the community and its language from the homogenizing pressures that dissolved similar linguistic hybrids elsewhere. Every summer, when temperatures in the enclosed bay rise to levels that make the village temporarily uninhabitable, the entire community relocates together, maintaining a collective migration pattern that has likely been in practice for centuries. KUMZAR became this way through the strait's role as a transit corridor. Every civilization that passed through left traces in the vocabulary of those who watched them go. The current threat is generational. Younger KUMZARIs increasingly move to Qeshm or Muscat for work and education. And the conditions of modern connectivity, when they reach isolated places, tend to dissolve what isolation preserved. Places like KUMZAR remind us that language is not just a means of communication, but a record of every force that shaped the people who speak it. The Strait of Hormuz is a place that, by any rational accounting of comfort or predictability, should not sustain the life it does. A corridor too narrow for the weight it carries, an island too mineral strange for conventional agriculture, a sea too hot for the coral that nonetheless grows within it, and a set of communities too isolated, too exposed, and too pressured by forces entirely beyond their control to have produced what they have produced. Languages assembled from the ruins of passing empires, architectural systems that cool stone buildings without electricity, food cultures drawn directly from the geology underfoot, and a knowledge of the sea so precise that it was never written down because it did not need to be. As the world moves into a future defined less by stability than by pressure, by heat, by resource scarcity, by the collapse of certainties that were always more fragile than they appeared. Hormuz begins to feel not like an edge case, but like a preview, a place where the conditions that the rest of the world is only beginning to confront have been the ordinary terms of existence for centuries. The people who live here did not wait for the crisis to begin learning how to endure it. And the question that this place leaves open quietly, without instruction, is whether we are paying attention. This is not a story that ends at the strait. Across the world, there are places shaped by the same logic. Places that have always known what stability was never promised to anyone. And places that suggest this journey has only just begun.